everyone, and welcome to the podcast. This is the first in a series of podcasts that we're going to have, and this one we're going to focus on metrics. And our special guest for this podcast is Dan Olsen. Dan Olsen is both a product management trainer and consultant, and also the author of the Lean Product Playbook. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, Rachel, thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited to be here on the first episode of your new podcast where we get to geek out on analytics.
Me too. So for this first podcast, we want to talk everything about product metrics and how organizations can be more data-driven. So let me start with that. Where do you start if you want to be more data-driven as a product organization?
That's a great question. That term data-driven gets thrown out a lot, right? And some organizations are naturally data-driven and some aren't, and they want to be more data-driven. So, I think it starts with the desire to be data-driven if your company doesn't already have that. So somebody in your company would want to bring that to your company. A lot of times it'll start out in product management. It might be the function that says, hey, maybe they worked at a company before that was more data-driven, that was using analytics more, and they bring that. And so part of it is starting out with is getting your fingers on the data, right? And so there's kind of like a metrics maturity model that I talk about sometimes. So level one is, having the desire to do it. And then level two is like, okay, are we actually getting the data? And that can be either in-house, like, accessing your own database. There's obviously good data that lives in your database or your financial systems, but usually you want to go well beyond that and use third-party analytic tools, like Heap, for example, that have best in class kind of data tracking of how people are really using your product. And so there's a certain amount of setup required, an investment and setup just to get that set up. Honestly, these days, it's not that much. It's usually just a simple JavaScript include. And that's how you get started. And then the next step is, great, now that we've got the kind of plumbing in place, what do we want to pay attention to? What do we want to track? Some analytic systems, you have to kind of figure out what you want to track and go in and manually instrument it. And there's incremental effort for that. Other systems like Heap, they have auto capture, which basically captures all the events that are happening on the front end, and you can go in and figure out later. So you kind of need to get the plumbing in place. Then you say, okay, what do I want to actually look at and pay attention to? And then usually once people get a taste of that, they start seeing that. And in fact, I'll share real quick an epiphany I had when I was working at Intuit. I was working on Quicken. It was basically a CD-ROM. It was a connected product. It would connect to the internet to download transactions and stock prices. But I went from doing that product where we would ship a CD-ROM once a year. And if you think about the metrics that we got, they weren't that great. We would get like monthly sales reports, like how many sold at Best Buy, how many sold at Fry's, which is sadly gone now, those kind of things. It was very high level, not actionable product feedback at all. And I went from that environment to doing an online product. And like the day we launched the online product, I remember just going to the engineers going, hey, how many people signed up yesterday? I'm like, let me check. He does a little SQL query, 100. All right, cool. And like each day, and then you say, well, what? There's two ways to sign up. How many signed up this way versus that way? You start asking more and more questions. So I've seen that light bulb go off. And once you start seeing the power of the data, it makes you ask questions and get more insights. It's addicting and it makes you want to kind of iterate and get better.
So going to the second thing that you were talking about, which is figuring out which metrics you want to pay attention to. What do you advise people when they're trying to figure that out?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's so many. Sometimes it's funny. I'll go and talk to a client and they'll be like, yeah, we're data driven. We have thousands of metrics. And it's almost like overwhelming, right? So you go from like having no metrics to having too many. Then you run into the challenge of, well, which one should we pay attention to? Which ones really matter? And so I think that's where the hard questions are. What matters the most for our business right now? And in my book, I talk about that, the metric that matters most. It's kind of like an optimization mindset. There's always one metric that's going to offer the highest ROI at that point in time. And over time, what metric that is will change, right? And, one of the frameworks I like to share a lot is Startup Metrics for Pirates by Dave McClure, the R, right? And it's just the beauty of that framework is those 5 apply to every product and every business, right? It's a great high level topology to think about. Any kind of detailed metric someone's going to bring up is going to fall into one of those 5 buckets, right? The one thing I like to say is for our friends that work in enterprise or B2B, referral tends to be the one that's a little less relevant for them, perhaps, or as important, but all the other ones are. Now, conversely, if you're working on some social product or communication product or viral product, then the referral could be like the most important thing. So, but those all apply, and the way to think about that is, acquisition means how do you get someone, off the street who knows nothing about your product to your front door effectively, right? To your web page or to your app store page so that they could become a customer, right? Activation is the act of someone going from a prospect to being a customer. Then once they become a customer, however you define that, whether it's a credit card or an email or whatever it is, then they're using your product. That's where retention comes in. Like, we know unfortunately that people don't keep using our product forever. Some people never come back after their first use. Some people use it every day. Some people use it every month. You've got the referral, which is your current customers generating prospects for you by word of mouth, whether it's digital or non-digital. And then you've got revenue. By virtue of people using your product, you're generating revenue. So one of those might be more important than the other ones, right? So at a high level, you want to kind of pick those. And I do have a generally preferred order that I think makes the most sense. Now, this applies when you have a new product. When you're launching a new product, and I like to refer to the leaky bucket metaphor here to help visualize this, which is you've got a bucket and you're trying to pour water into the bucket. You're spraying this hose. Imagine like a garden hose, and you're trying to spray. And the idea is the water that gets in the bucket, those are people that you convert into customers, right? So the water coming out of the hose is like the prospects. You can think about the volume of that being, how many people are coming to visit your webpage, for example. And then whatever percentage of those make it into the bucket, that's your conversion rate. And then retention is, unfortunately, not all the water stays in the bucket. It leaks out over time when people don't come back, right? So, and unfortunately, everyone's got a leaky bucket. Even Facebook and Google and those guys, they have leaky buckets, right? It's just kind of natural. Nobody has 100% retention rate. What I like to explain, I like to ask people, hey, if you have a brand new product that you just launched and you had to pick one, would you focus on acquisition first or conversion first or retention first? And I use that to illustrate this metric that matters most thinking. And, it's not necessarily true in 100% of the cases, but for most products, I would argue that the best order is to start with retention first, right? Because if you have a leaky bucket, and everybody starts with a leaky bucket with their V1 product, unfortunately, you can go spend all this time and effort on acquisition conversion, but it doesn't matter because then all the water is going to leak out, and I've worked with clients where unfortunately, like I had one client where they were getting featured by Apple like every month, like, App Store getting featured, and there's just like this huge spikes in active user acquisition. But then when we looked at the retention curve, we realized, hey, 3-day retention was basically zero. So like 3 days after these huge spikes, very few of those people were back. So it didn't matter that we were getting featured every day because we had a huge leaky bucket, right? So you want to get your retention shored up enough. And again, I'm not saying you're going to make it perfect, but usually starting with retention makes the most sense. Once that's kind of at the point of diminishing returns, then you want to switch to conversion rate optimization. And that's basically, again, your aim, like what percentage of people that are coming to our site actually become customers. Mm-hmm. And then acquisition, because then if you're spending, usually acquisition takes money, you're going to get a much higher ROI if your conversion rate has been improved and if your retention rate has been improved. So, for many businesses, that's the order. For new businesses, that's the order that matters the most: retention, conversion, acquisition, right? Again, if you're in the rare case that virality is very important, then by all means, you might just work on your viral loop first before you do anything else. That's kind of a corner case or exception, a certain class of products. And then once you're done with retention, conversion, acquisition, then you can turn your eye towards revenue. And that's where every business has to deal with retention, conversion, acquisition. They may define it slightly differently, but every business has to deal with those. Revenue is where now it gets specific with your business, basically. And so there's a whole other framework we can talk about later about revenue optimization. But so that's a long story, but that's like the general order that I've kind of realized I think makes the most sense in most cases.
Gotcha. So retention and then conversion rate optimization, which is kind of, it could be activation plus. We didn't talk about activation much, but that's kind of
I'll tell you why, because basically conversion activation are synonymous, but it would spell accurate wouldn't sound as priority. So most people just call it conversion, but when Dave did the framework, it's called activation. It's like, how do you activate a prospect into a customer? How do you convert a prospect into a customer? I think they're pretty synonymous. So likewise, people use the term engagement. There's overlap with engagement and retention. They're not necessarily exactly the same thing, but that's kind of another synonym situation.
So speaking of synonym situations, because I do find this a lot, that yes, there's overlap between engagement and retention. There's also the term adoption.
Yes, yes. No shortage of terms in the tech industry, right? Exactly. Yeah. So adoption. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, again, that's another way of saying people are adopting your product, they're starting to use your product, they're becoming customers, right? And I think that usually that focuses, adoption is a nice way that usually in the product world means you're focusing on kind of the new user experience, right? Which I think in the last, several years, people realize how important this is, right? We have a whole new category of products that have emerged in the last several years that focus on guides, onboarding guides, basically the whole new product category, right? And as we know, like even earlier, like things that improve conversion and acquisition are how you talk about your product. It has nothing to do with the actual features or code. It's like, how do you talk about it can impact it. And then once someone's going through the flow, what's ease of use? What's the user experience of that flow, right? And is it long? Does it take a lot of clicks? Ask a lot of questions? Is it short? Is it reinforcing the value proposition? Do you get, if it's really short, then do you get to kind of the page or screen that demonstrates the value right away? Like, what's the time, to see the brand promise actually manifested in front of your eyes? Because if you think about it, you're putting in all this time and effort, you're filling out the form, going through registration, filling out the configuration, whatever. All that is work they're putting in. When do I get the value? So like time to first value is kind of a way to think about that helps with that adoption.
So we've talked about all the good metrics. I'm sure we didn't cover them all. We covered a lot of ground. So let's say that you've defined your most important metrics and you have most of your metrics put together. How do you suggest people operationalize that across the organization? And that could be things like, how often are you reviewing them? Like, who are you sharing them with? Like all those, like, how is it more than just, hey, you're a product manager and you're looking at data to make decisions?
And that's a really important part of it. If you want to grow up that metrics maturity curve, a big part of all these tools is transparency, right? In the old days, you would have like the centralized analytics group and you would go and fill out a TPS report and say, I need this report. And then they would go in their queue. And then like a month later, you'd get a canned PDF report. Here you go, right?
This still happens in many organizations.
I know it does. I know. But that's part of that maturity, right? So this is about self-service, democratization, and transparency, right? Anybody can get their fingers on the data, which is great. I mean, and I know Heap has some awesome governance features so people can set stuff up. You have the people that can but I'm talking about consumption. Like I'm talking about visualization and consumption. So that's an important part of this is, having a tool that has that kind of capability, which all of them do. And then also dashboards, right? So once you agree, if we go through this process, you set up the plumbing, the instrumentation, then you agree as a group on what the key metrics are we need to focus on. Then you need to kind of set up the dashboard of the visualization. And as you said, like what's the frequency that we're tracking? Should we be looking at this daily, weekly, monthly, right? And sometimes the right answer is multiple time periods or different time periods for different metrics, right? So, and then you just get people in the habit of looking at the dashboard. And so it's not like there's one town crier going, hey, conversion rate just took a big hit. Like several people should realize that on their own because they're looking at that dashboard. And then you get into the advanced situation where, instead of it being like a 5-year-old soccer game where everyone's on the soccer ball together, you divide and conquer. And it's like, okay, I've got my acquisition dashboard because I'm focused on that. I've got the conversion dashboard because I'm focused on that. I'm on retention, so where you get to that division of you divide and conquer, which gets into how we nest these metrics up. And again, if we go deeper in revenue, at some point for revenue, the concept that I share is the equation of your business. You can express your revenue formulaically. You can say, okay, well, like if we're a SaaS business, it's just how many paying customers we have times the average revenue per customer in a month. And then we can break it down. You basically keep breaking it down and say, okay, well, the number of customers we have this month is however many customers we had last month, diminished by some churn rate plus the new people that we acquired, right? So we can kind of break it down, and then you can, as a team, look at that and then say, which of these metrics do we think offers the highest ROI? And we didn't get into that, which is, you want to have baseline metrics for your key metrics, and then you want to look across them. And this is that kind of lean analytics process I share in my book and in my talks. where once you've identified the key metric, okay, we think this metric matters most and we want to improve that metric. Well, then you go into a metric specific optimization loop where you say, okay, let's say there's a given conversion rate we want to improve. Well, then we say as a cross-functional team, let's brainstorm what are all the different ideas we have for how we can improve that metric, right? And then you're going to estimate, okay, we think this idea might improve the conversion rate by 2% or 3%. And that estimation can be hard. As long as it's kind of on a relative basis, everything will work out. And then you kind of can talk about, well, how much effort would each of those take or cost? And you can do a rough ROI. It doesn't have to be super precise. You pick the top improvement idea for that conversion rate, you design it, you implement it, you roll it out, and you see if the metric goes up and to the right. And you hope it goes up and to the right, but even if it doesn't, you've gained because you've learned. You're like, huh, that didn't work. And you're going to go back and revise your hypotheses. And eventually you're going to find an idea. And especially when you first start, there's a lot of low hanging fruit. It's like very exciting at the beginning because you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was broken, you know? And you don't know what you don't see, right? It's like and then you'll knock out the easy stuff and then it'll get harder. And at some point, instead of continuing to work on that metric, it'll make sense to go back and say, okay, that one's pretty optimized. Well, let's go back. Like I was saying, retention, we might start with retention first, right? And spoiler is like retention is basically the most direct measure of product market fit. So if you have a new product, you know, and you don't have a non-zero retention rate, just there's no point in doing anything else on conversion or acquisition, right? Just keep tweaking and iterating your product and talking to customers until you get to a non-zero retention curve, right? The terminal value, that means you're holding on to some water in your bucket. And from then you can work on conversion and acquisition.
So there are a number of topics in there that I want to double click on. And so one of them was you were talking about key metrics, and then you were also talking about how you move them. And I think we were getting a little bit into the world of KPIs and OKRs. And I know that there's a lot of confusion out there between KPIs and OKRs. So how do you think about them?
Well, they're both TLAs. I think we got to acknowledge that, which is 3-letter acronym. So there's plenty of those, again, in the tech world, right? So and in fact, I just had my friend Christina Woodkey has written one of the top books on OKRs, Radical Focus. The second edition just came out like 2 weeks ago. So if you're curious about OKRs, I would highly recommend her book. John Doerr also wrote a book on OKRs. So those are kind of like two of the top books on OKRs. But let's go back to KPI because I think that's probably so KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. It's kind of a fancy phrase. It makes a fancy acronym, but at the end of the day, it's basically like a key metric. Like performance means like what matters to us and what would be a key performance indicator, like, you know, like revenue per user or conversion rate or retention rate. Those would be KPIs, for example, right? So it's just like, what do we agree is a key metric that we want to track? OKR is a little more complex. It's objectives and key results. So it's not just like one thing, it's multiple things. So there's an objective that you're trying to achieve. You know, your objective, you know, might be maximize revenue or decrease churn or something like that, you know, and then your key results would be like, well, how would we know? What does success mean in that? I mean, and you might have a fuzzier objective, like let's make customers happier or increase customer happiness or whatever, right? And then the key results would be things like retention, NPS score, things like that. So the key results are meant to be like the brass tacks of how would you know, right? Which again, end up translating down to some key metric that you're measuring, right? Although sometimes it can be more binary, like we need to launch on Android by March 1st. It's kind of Boolean at that, it's more binary. So sometimes with OKRs, it can be more binary. If you get more advanced in them, some people that do it in an advanced way want you to be able to score, did you do it or not? And again, the harshest is either you did it or you didn't. So it's like if you had a sales goal of 1 million and you came in at 950, you get no credit, right? And so then some people are like, that's not fair. So they do a prorated kind of credit scale on that. So, so at a high level, that's basically what those are and how they're a little bit different.
So another one of the things you touched on was experimentation. And so I know we're getting a little bit out of the realm of metrics, but you know, how do you think about like when you need to experiment versus just do something?
Yeah, experimentation is a natural, logical extension of analytics in my mind, right? It's like you need to have the infrastructure in place so that you can have a control and say, okay, we're controlling this conversion rate. Now let's try some stuff and try different experiments and see if we can move the needle in a statistical basis, right? So one of the key important concepts of experimentation is you have a baseline, you have like the current champion or the current status quo, and then you're going to try one or more. A, B implies A is status quo, B is the new thing, but you can, you can test multiple things at once. There are ways to do that. The idea then is, okay, let's say the conversion rate on our existing flow and user experience is 10%, and we run an experiment, and the new one comes out at 10.5%. Is it really better or not? Is that noise, or is there signal there, right? And so there's calculations like chi-squared that tell you based on the sample sizes, is it really statistically significant or not, right? The good news is most experimentation software, that's all baked in, so you don't have to worry about it. You can kind of run the experiment. So that's exciting. It's really exciting, and then the funny thing though is when you get advanced in experimentation, I think many of us have heard about the Google experiment on the color blue used for the links, and how they tried 42 different shades of blue and they found the optimal shade of blue, right? So, I have a bit of a math background, and I think of like local maxima, and I think of like 3D shapes and things like that. It's like, okay, they must have like eked out a little, like point something percent, but that's great. That's totally cool. But now what, right? So the funny thing is, again, when you're optimizing like a landing page to optimize conversion rate, the logical, the things that most people run to is like, let's change the image, hero image, let's change the tagline, let's change the button, the color, the size, So you kind of hit all this, what I'll call immediately obvious stuff, and it's good, don't get me wrong, like get that optimization done. But then you get to this point, you're like, okay, now what? What do we do now? We ran out of spaghetti to throw against the wall. And you then get to this point of realizing, okay, I need to build a mental model and have hypotheses about, why customers are doing what they're doing. And I need to then, you need to kind of get deeper in your thinking about what is it? Is there some missing functionality? Or is there an underserved segment that we could address? Or is our messaging off? Things like that. Are we missing some key benefit? Things like that, right? So it's fun and exciting to see the immediate rewards of like kind of UX design optimization. But then you get to the deeper things of like product optimization, which can be really exciting as well.